This video is brought to you by Harold Sack, who gave me a massive 1 year's worth of subscriptions on Patreon. Toph the First Metalbender is a bit of a weird one to wrap, well, it's a difficult one for me to wrap my small mind around. It makes non-token artifacts that we have in play into lands, so that means that any artifacts that we cast will trigger Landfall, which we do have a decent amount of in the deck. And then it has a second ability of, at the beginning of the end step, you Earthbend 2. That means that you put a couple of plus counters on a land and it turns it into a man land. That will of course work on your artifacts as well, because they count as lands. This is where it all gets a bit weird. Basically, you have to remember that the artifacts are lands in addition to artifacts. Haven't built too much around the earthbending, but you can get a decent amount of protection from the earthbending, so basically for now just focus on the fact that the artifacts are lands in addition to their other types. Just because they're lands doesn't mean that they can tap for mana though, which means we have to include things like Urborg, Maya. The Chromatic Lantern is going to make it so that the artifacts that Toph makes into lands can tap for mana. Same with Dryad of the Elysian Grove, we get any colour of mana from these two, which makes them really good for fixing. Dryad of the Elysian Grove allows us to play an additional land per turn as well, not relevant with the artifacts, but actual land drops it helps. And then finally here, Miria, Scholar of Antiquity. Taps an artifact for a green and you can tap two of them to Impulse Draw and you'll be able to cast that spell until the end of the turn. There are a few untapped shenanigans in here, so I thought Miria was worth including, not only for the mana but for that second ability as well. So on the Landfall front, we've got the cards that you would expect. Lotus Cobra ramps, as does Tireless Provisioner. Springheart Nantuko is likely going to just make a bunch of insects, but you can put this on copies of manlands that you have in play. That either being the lands that have been animated into manlands or the artifacts that have become lands. From which point, every time you get Landfall, you'll be able to pay 2 and make copies of things like, I don't know, Solemn Simulacrums and stuff like that. I'm sure there's plenty of degeneracy that will come from the Springheart Nantuko. Tireless Tracker will make a myriad of clue tokens, which we can sacrifice with our vast amounts of mana that we're going to have from the artifacts becoming lands, and that will keep our hand nice and full. Then for some token generation, the Chocobo Racetrack is an artifact, so it will actually trigger itself as long as our commander's in play. So it enters with a Chocobo token, but any artifacts and or lands that enter after that will also continue to make tokens and buff said tokens. Greensleeves gets us some Badger tokens upon landfall as well, and Avenger of Zendikar will not only see all the lands that we have in play, but all the artifact lands that we have in play. And then the landfall trigger for the buffing of this vast amount of plant tokens will be from lands and the artifacts entering. I'm sure you are noticing a pattern at this point. I just want to explain this section now because it's on my mind while I'm talking. We have the Candelabra of Tornos here, which is a 2.5 grand card, so obviously you shouldn't feel the need to rush out and buy this. You can definitely proxy it, I think, as long as your play group is okay with that. There's a nice Magic Online artwork version of this. A 1-mana artifact that has an activated ability of X, untap X separate lands. So this goes well with anything that taps for multiple mana. Grim Monolith, Basalt Monolith, Mana Vault, stuff like that. Actually don't have any of that in the deck because this is bracket 3 and I'm limited on the number of game changers I can have, but we do have Gaia's Cradle, which taps for a green per creature we control. Looking to have a decent amount of creatures with the artifacts and lands being animated, plus the actual creatures that we want to play anyhow. So with the Candelabra of Tornos being a land with our commander, we can untap this and any other of our artifacts / lands, which would be Gaia's Cradle in this instance. You could target Mana Vault or something like that, netting mana every time, and you just do that infinitely, untapping the Gaia's Cradle and the Candelabra, plus anything else. You've got infinite taps and untaps if they're relevant, but more importantly you've got infinite mana as well. Mycosynth Lattice is going to make every single permanent an artifact, and that means that every one of our permanents is an artifact and a land. That'll be relevant for a reason that I will disclose in a minute. And then Hue of the Entwood, it's not a combo, but it's a nice little interaction, or a nice big interaction hopefully. Sacrifice any number of lands. You don't necessarily even have to touch your lands here, you can just sacrifice the artifacts that just so happen to be lands. Reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of lands sacked this way. Choose any number of artifacts and or lands revealed this way. All the artifacts go into play first, then all the lands. It's unfortunate that our commander doesn't touch tokens, unfortunately, but if you have a surplus of artifact lands in play, and you're not getting much other use out of them, then you can recycle them with Hugh the Entwood. Just while we're here quickly as well, Annie joins up and Panharmonicon are double trigger effects, so the artifacts entering cause an additional ETB. That means that Panharmonicon is going to trigger landfall effects twice, as well as the ETBs of the artifacts themselves twice, because the artifacts are lands as well as artifacts, of course. And Annie joins up, gets us more earthbending on our commander. Not too worried about the earthbending, but it can protect more permanents for us, keeps them from being destroyed or exiled, and we can get more ETBs if we use a sack outlet or something. Plus it deals 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker upon entry, so it's half decent spot removal as well as the double triggers. Anyway, let's have a look at what I was referring to with this Mycosynth Lattice. If all of our stuff is artifacts and lands, then it means that we can make use of board wipes that only care about destroying non-land permanents. So for instance, with Hour of Revelation, destroy all non-land permanents. Our artifacts are lands, so that means that all of our artifacts and all of our lands are going to be left alone by these very harsh wraths. Our opponents will pretty much be stripped down to their lands, but we will get to keep most of our stuff. It will still hit our enchantments and our creatures. We do have some means of making our other permanents into artifacts with Liquimetal Torque and Liquimetal Coating, which is then ready to be earthbended. But the instant that they become artifacts, they do become lands as well with our commander, which means that they dodged the Hour of Revelation effects. If you have these effects on permanents such as Scourglass or the Cataclysmic Gearhulk, then you can actually earthbend these very easily as well with them being lands. And that means whenever, for instance, you activate the Scourglass, it will wipe out all the non-artifacts and non-lands, taking out planeswalkers, enchantments, creatures, and then this will re-enter play immediately because it was earthbended, ready to do it again, so you could potentially do this every turn cycle. You would need to have your commander become an artifact though, in order to dodge being wrathed by such effects. Cataclysmic Gearhulk is good for this because you can choose a creature, an enchantment, an artifact and a planeswalker to have survive the Cataclysm, but this is good not only because it's on an artifact permanent, but also because it causes a sacrifice as well, so pretty much going to wipe your opponents down to lands and a small handful of non-land permanents, whereas it is looking at non-land permanents specifically. So we basically with this get to keep all of our artifacts because the artifacts are lands and this cares about seeing non-lands. Basically these wraths will dodge most of our board and wipe out most of our opponents. On a bit further down to ramp, these are all going to count as landfall as well, don't forget, but we do have some actual landfall effects for the early game. I might have to replace these with rocks, because I have a feeling that when I start playing this deck I'm just going to wish that I had more and more and more artifacts to play. We've already been over the relevance of Liquimetal Coating. This actually isn't a ramp piece, it only does the turn something into an artifact thing, unless we can tap our artifact lands for mana, that is. But we've already been over the utility of these two. Mind Stone and Hedron Archive can be sacrificed for card draw, and if they've been earthbended they'll just come straight back into play, so that's something that we could do at the end of an opponent's turn before ours starts. Doesn't lose us out on any mana in that instance. Prized Statue is similar in that it can be reoccurred in order to make more treasure mana upon entry and upon death. But we've got some more permanents that care about ETBs and landfall as well. Earthbender Ascension, I think, is one of the only other Earthbender effects in the deck. I didn't lean too much into it, like I said. But this enters and gives us a rampant growth, as well as earthbending / protecting another artifact. And then Reaped Harvest, another good one to sacrifice because it's a permanent that will come back with said earthbending. When it enters and when it's sacrificed, you get to rampant growth. So play it, rampant growth, sacrifice it to a sack outlet or to its own ability to rampant growth again. It's been earthbended, so it re-enters and rampant growths again. I'm just thinking now, looking at this 3 CMC stuff, it might be worth getting rid of like Farseek or something to make room for Commander's Sphere. I don't often run Commander's Sphere, but in a deck where you want to recur your artifacts, sacrificing it for a card draw and still having it in play to tap for mana once it re-enters might be decent. There's so many directions you can go with this commander, so it does get confusing. Noteworthy that I've included Sword of Feast and Famine as well. This will not only untap all of your lands, but it will untap all the artifacts as well. Then for card draw, we've got a half decent selection. Esper Sentinel, once it becomes a land, can be earthbended, and that means that it can be buffed with a couple of plus counters, so likely to draw more cards with that in that instance. Demand Answers, discard a card, ready to reanimate it later. Again, haven't leaned too much into the reanimation stuff, but this is half decent card draw anyway. Eco Wellspring, good sack fodder. Enters and leaves, it will draw a card each time. And then some more interesting stuff. All Fate's Scroll is a rock that can tap for mana, but it can also be sacrificed for 7 and a tap, where you draw X cards, where X is the number of differently named lands you control. That typically wouldn't be too great outside of a 4 or 5 colour deck. But we can generate so much mana with this deck, as well as the fact that this will see all of our artifacts as lands, and so of course they're all differently named lands in that instance. We can easily draw north of 10 cards with this without even trying. Brass's Tunnel Grinder, a bit of a one-sided wheel. If we get flooded or something like that, it's going to be handy to trade out those lands for a bunch of new cards straight off the top. Valakut Exploration, I did have some Landfall Pingers in the deck, and this is the only one that remains, I think. It's just not an eggs style of deck where you're constantly cycling little rocks in and out of the bin all the time. I might have to make another variant of this list where we lean more into the Landfall Pingers, but Valakut Exploration is going to see the lands and artifacts enter and get us a little bit of impulse draw, and if we don't make use of said impulse draw, then it will burn our opponents instead. Bright Glass Gearhulk can go and get combo pieces for us, or cheap ones at least. Searches for up to 2 artifacts, creatures and or enchantments with mana value 1 or less, so we can go and grab like Lotus Petal or Sol Ring or the Candelabra. Esper Sentinel, plenty of targets to go after with this. Survey Mechan, a 1/3 flyer with hexproof. Its 10 mana and sacrifice ability is going to cost X less, where X is the number of differently named lands you control, similar to the All Fate Scroll. These are from the same set. So it's likely going to cost 1, 2, 0 mana in order to deal 3 damage to any target. Target player draws 3 cards and gains 3 life. Again, this is yet another use for the Earthbending mechanic, where this just sacrifices itself for that ability, and you can keep your hand full as well as keeping this in play. And speaking of keeping your hand full, there's not many better ways to do it than with the One Ring, and we're not too worried about the damage on this because we have sack outlets in the deck, so we can soon get rid of this if the burden becomes too great. Reanimation, I said I didn't lean too heavily into, as we can see here. Scrap Trawler, I don't think there's any kind of combo with, but with the Earthbending, it's particularly good to just sit there on its own. Another artifact is Earthbended and sacrificed. Scrap Trawler will see other artifacts dying and go and look for an artifact in the graveyard with lesser mana value and put it back into hand, ready for you to do more degenerate stuff with. So if you were to sacrifice a Wayfarer's Bauble, you can go and grab your Lotus Petal back or something like that. Scrap Mastery and Wake the Past are going to reanimate all the artifacts. Scrap Mastery you can easily set up for yourself where you get all of your artifacts and don't lose out on any, whereas your opponents are going to sacrifice all theirs. You just use some of the sack outlets we have in the deck to wipe your own board and then cast Scrap Mastery and get all the artifacts back again straight away. And then Emiria Shepherd. Do I go over a combo now before I forget? This is another landfall effect where if a land enters, it will bring a permanent from our graveyard back to hand. We're not worried about the planes thing because not likely that we're going to make our artifacts into planes specifically. But this tied with Lotus Petal, which is a 0 mana artifact that taps and sacrifices itself for a mana of any colour, means that we can sacrifice the Lotus Petal, put it into the graveyard, and then play something like the Zuran Orb. Zuran Orb will be a land, of course, so that will trigger the landfall on Emiria Shepherd, bringing us back the Lotus Petal. We've still got that mana floating. We can then sacrifice Zuran Orb to its own ability. It can only sacrifice lands, but Zuran Orb will be a land. It's now in the graveyard. Play the Lotus Petal to trigger the landfall on Emiria Shepherd, which brings back the Zuran Orb we just sacrificed, and it's rinse and repeat. We can get infinite life doing that from the Zuran Orb, and infinite mana from the Lotus Petal. We're a bit lacking on the spot removal front because of all the one-sided wraths that I decided to include. But Haywire Might, of course, with Earthbending will come straight back into play after we sacrifice it to exile an artifact or an enchantment. Swords to Plowshares is just Swords to Plowshares. It's too cheap not to run really. And then not removal, it's more little bits of annoying interaction really. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls causes a land to be binned, we return the land straight back to play. So let's say they went for a Vandal Blast onto us or something and wiped out all of our artifacts. This, if they were lands, will bring them straight back into play. Terra Eternal, I'm on the fence about. It gives all lands indestructible. That includes our opponent's stuff, so if we want to take out their Cabal Coffers or Gaia's Cradles or Nykthos, whatever, no one is going to be able to do that while they are indestructible. But this does of course affect all of our artifacts for only 3 mana, so I'm going to try it, but it could be that it's too much of a downside for my liking. The Stasis Coffin is another one that is to be used with Earthbending, so 3 to play, and then 2 tap and sacrifice it, or exile it specifically I should say. You gain protection from everything until the end of the turn, so you can't be dealt damage, you can't be targeted. And of course with the Earthbending it cares about both dying and exile, so when things are exiled like this it was meant to protect from loops such as this. It will, with its Earthbending, come straight back into play, ready for you to potentially gain protection from everything for another turn. Gonti's Aetherheart would go much better in an eggs style list as well, when we're just littering the board with little Cheerios artifacts. Whenever it or another artifact enters, we get 2 energy, and then we can pay 8 energy to exile it and take an extra turn after this one. Again, Earthbending cares about exile as well as dying. So for every 3 artifacts this sees enter play after the Gonti's Aetherheart, we'll get an extra turn. Shouldn't be too difficult to get a bunch of artifacts into play. That does mean that with like the Zuran Orb and Lotus Petal combo we just went over previously, we don't have infinite turns, but we do get enough extra turns to get a lot of value out of it with the Gonti's Aetherheart. This does consistently need to get the Earthbending on it, which we can't get that much. Just once per turn with our Toph really. And we do have more sack outlets because a decent number of the artifacts are going to have ETBs on them. So once they're Earthbended, they'll have had their ETB upon entry, sacrifice them, and they get another ETB. And having free sack outlets is a good means of controlling such things. So Sylvan Safekeeper is going to give a creature we control Shroud. Can use that to protect our commander or any creature in play. Arcbound Ravager, gonna put a plus counter on it. That sacrifices an artifact specifically, but it's only artifacts we're really going to want to sacrifice anyway. Not too worried about sacrificing basics and stuff. And then same with Krark-Clan Ironworks, sack an artifact to make 2 colourless mana. So with that Zuran Orb combo I went over previously, instead of sacrificing the orb to itself for infinite mana, you could make the combo much faster by making a bunch of colourless mana every time, as well as the coloured mana from the Lotus Petal. That's only really relevant on Magic Online, where you actually have to click through all these things. And not so much sack outlets, more ramp really, but you can sacrifice an ETB Earthbended permanent in order to bring it back into play and get another ETB on it, and then the Entish Restoration or Harrow would resolve and get you some more basics into play. And after all that, it's just lands really, so the Gaia's Cradle goes well with the Candelabra of Tornos, like I said. Field of the Dead is in here as well because it's basically landfall. We're definitely going to be triggering this very easily because of all the differently named lands that we will control thanks to the artifacts. And this of course goes well with the Gaia's Cradle in particular, because it will make it tap for even more mana, making the Candelabra combo even more relevant. Decided to try out Even Though as well, the fair version of Gaia's Cradle. If we are making enough creatures to make this relevant, then we should have enough power on the board to be able to activate it. But yeah, that's pretty much it for Toph the First Metalbender. I'm not sure if I'm pulling in too many different directions in this list. I'm eager to try it out and see if I need to really hone it in and focus on one particular strategy. There's so many things that you can do with Toph that you really have to be making or considering multiple lines of play, multiple variants of the list maybe. Like I said, there's reanimation with Earthbending, you could focus more on Earthbending. There's Cheerios and eggs. There's Landfall specifically, you could get a lot of token generation going or ping effects from the Landfall. You could even go for flicker effects because Toph cares about exile, like I pointed out before. Anyway, let me know what your versions of Toph are, what you think the best version of it is, and hopefully you'll join me for the gameplay very soon. Massive thank you to the patrons for their financial support of the channel. I'm TribalKai. Thank you for watching.